Ever Ancient, Ever New by Winfield Bevins. Introduction and Foreword. Or rather, Foreword and Introduction. Foreword by Scott McKnight. There used to be two kinds of churches. Historic churches connected to historic denominations, like the Episcopal Church, the Presbyterian Church, the Methodist Church, the Roman Catholic Church, and the various national branches of the Orthodox Church, and churches that were not quite as historic, often called free churches or non-denominational churches, like the American Baptist churches or the Southern Baptist Church. The former have constraints imposed by the denomination's historic teaching, practices, and leaders. The latter are autonomous and can do mostly what they think the Lord would have them do. Change for the former is a challenge. Change for the latter is much easier, though one cannot pretend it's as easy as that. Now there are three kinds: historic churches, autonomous churches, and autonomous churches picking up what the historic churches have always done and sometimes leaving the world of autonomy for the wisdom of a denomination. At the center of this movement, and Winfield Bevins' research proves that this is no fly-by-night experiment by a few creative or restoratives, and that this is a genuine, growing movement, is the lectionary and liturgy. That is, churches that at one time were part of a movement to get away from all things formal and institutional are now seeing the wisdom of the formal use of the lectionary and the potency of liturgy. While some have abandoned the autonomous world of the free churches to join the Roman Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church, a far larger number is shifting towards the Anglican Communion. At the heart of this shift is nothing less than the beauty and theological grandeur of the Book of Common Prayer, whose words, Alan Jacobs tell us, are to be living words in the mouths of those who have a living faith, which has been the knock on all lectionary and liturgy-driven churches. That is, routine, rote, rut-sunk recitations of ancient words can deaden and have deadened many, and many in the free church traditions continue to make that claim. I'm not one, and neither is Winfield. I grew up in an autonomous church loosely connected to conservative Baptists, and I had no reason to break loose and join the Presbyterians or the Methodists or the Episcopals in my hometown. When Chris and I and our two children, Laura and Lucas, moved to Nottingham, England, we were invited to attend St. Peter's Church, Towton, with a curate named John Corey. We had never used the Book of Common Prayer, but on the very first Sunday, along with wondering why the music didn't have notes and worrying about when to stand or sit, I heard the first words of the collects, those weekly prayers recited, often from rote memory. My born-again past met the living faith of living words in the collects, and I was overwhelmed, and have been ever since. I am an Anglican deacon today, canon theologian to Bishop Todd Hunter in the C4SO Diocese, which is one group in the Anglican Church of North America, a denomination with a historic past. And I am so largely because the worship ordered by the Book of Common Prayer affirms in me what I most believe about Sunday worship and daily prayer ought to be. Sacred words for sacred moments for a sacred people gathered for a sacred purpose. This ordered worship in the Book of Common Prayer is not magical, and without faith, the words deaden. What I have witnessed in the last few decades, and one cannot minimize the impact of John Stott, J.I. Packer, Robert Webber, and the scores of Wheaton students who became Anglican and have become leaders in the American evangelical scene, is that when a genuine born-again faith meets up with the Book of Common Prayer, the encounter is transforming. The movement sketched by Winfield Bevins tells the story of many who know that all creativity is more boring than all tradition, that the words of the lectionary and liturgy are theologically sound and gospel saturated, and that one suddenly comes into fresh weekly and daily contact with the great tradition of the Church. Winfield is right. This way is ever ancient, and at the same time, ever new. And that was Scott McKnight, professor of the New Testament at Northern Seminary. Introduction. Late have I loved you, O beauty, ever ancient, ever new. St. Augustine. Sarah Grace is a 20-year-old university student who has a contagious smile and a deep love for God. During a recent trip to England, she had an unusual life-changing encounter. Sarah and a group of 20 other university students traveled to London to sing as a part of a choral cathedral residency. During the trip, she had her first encounter with traditional liturgy. During this encounter, Sarah found that embracing the church's ancient roots transformed her faith and widened her perspective of worship in ways she had never imagined. The experience was intimidating and somewhat unexpected. Singing hymns and processing through the congregation, sitting and standing at designated times, and reading corporate prayers didn't exactly fall within my realm of comfort, she said. However, once I began to focus on what was being said or sung rather than the way it was done, the services took on a whole new meaning. Through this experience, Sarah became open to some of the historic, liturgical practices of worship. Suddenly, she said, the words of believers from thousands of years before were on my lips, ringing out as true and pure as the day they were written. I was connecting with the universal church in ways that transcended time and space, and I was deepening roots that I didn't even realize I had. Every element of the service, from the breathtaking architecture to the ethereal choral melodies to the heartfelt recitation of the liturgy, presented me with an opportunity to bask in the transcendence of God and to respond with awestruck praise. When I first heard Sarah Grace describe her encounter, I thought to myself, I've heard this story before. I've lived this story. As someone who has made the journey from non-liturgical churches to helping lead churches that regularly practice liturgical worship, Sarah's statements about the allure of liturgy ring true for me as well. I was raised in a Southern Baptist home, but I came to faith in a Pentecostal church. I gleaned a great deal from these traditions and the experiences they offered, experiences that continue to shape me today. I experienced being born again and filled with the Spirit. Yet despite the many positive contributions these traditions made to my spiritual journey, it felt as if something was missing, but I couldn't discern what that something was. Reflecting back on my early years as a believer, I now realize I longed for a sense of connection to the past, to the traditions, practices, and beliefs that have shaped Christian experience for the past 2,000 years. This longing wasn't a rejection of my heritage, but has taken shape as a desire to be part of a more sacramental tradition, one connected to the historic Christian faith. I come from a low church background, from a church that believed in the power of the Bible, but had little interest in a more structured worship service. We did not speak of liturgy, and even if we had one, it was not intentionally connected to the past, to the historic church. I always felt like something was missing. I longed for a deeper, broader expression of my faith. I needed more than repeated admonitions to pray and read the Bible myself. Time and time again, I found I couldn't go deeper on my own. I was searching for something to guide me into the depths of God's love and grace. I didn't know it at the time, but I needed what liturgy had to offer. In seminary, I worked at a church that faithfully preached the word every week, but only celebrated communion once a year. And even when we celebrated the Lord's Supper, the church did not approach the practice as a sacrament. Communion was a memorial exercise, a vague remembrance of Christ's sacrifice. To be honest, it felt like communion was simply a last-minute add-on to the service, with little, if any, spiritual significance. I knew this practice had held deep significance for generations of believers, and I sensed that there had to be more to celebrating it than I was currently experiencing. One day I stumbled into a local Episcopal church. As I entered the service, I wasn't sure what I would encounter. Sitting in the pew, I fumbled my way through the liturgy, the established order of worship, with the help of the rector and 3 elderly ladies. To my surprise, I encountered the risen Christ at the Lord's table that day in a way I had never experienced before. What was different? I found that the liturgy enabled me to experience Christ, not just in my head and heart, but also through my bodily senses. I felt a palpable sense of the sacred in that worship service, a connection with something transcendent and otherworldly. This particular Episcopal church had created a sacred space through its beautiful aesthetic of historic architecture, the reading of Scripture, and the recitation of several historic prayers. I felt the burning sensation of the wine down my throat as I sipped the fruit of the vine from a chalice. In that little parish church, I fell in love with the beauty and mystery of liturgy. Even though much of the service was foreign to me, it felt strangely like I had come home. Much like Sarah Grace, I was looking for a connection to my larger Christian family, and the attraction of liturgy was that it offered me a window into practices and patterns that have shaped Christians for generations. The roots of the Christian church began not with modern evangelicalism, but at the time of Christ, long before the modern Western church. I longed to see, experience, and understand liturgical practices and how they were connected to those historic roots. Like many contemporary Christians, I had neglected 2,000 years of church history. I was beginning to realize there is much we can glean from the past as we seek to develop Christian practices for this generation. For years I had felt like a spiritual orphan, unaware of my rich family heritage. Like a fatherless child discovering a rich family genealogy for the first time, I came to understand my own spiritual genealogy through the ancient practices of the liturgy. Over the past decade, I have learned that I'm not alone in my experience. I've spent countless hours speaking with young adults who have shared similar stories of deep curiosity and interest in the historic expressions of the Christian faith and the practices of the liturgy. This is one reason I've written this book, to learn why young adults who are natives to the digital world and heavily reliant upon technology are so interested in traditions that have been around for 2,000 years. I know what first led me to follow these longings, but I wanted to know more. What is the allure of liturgy for a new generation? As I've interviewed pastors and talked with young adults around the United States, I've discovered a generation that is searching for God in the midst of unprecedented social and cultural change. These are sincere Christ followers looking to face the challenges of a postmodern, post-Christian world that is increasingly multicultural, secularized, and globalized. The result of my journey is this book, a profile of a slice of this emerging generation that is seeking to rediscover the ancient roots of the Christian faith. For many years now, articles, surveys, and news reports have lamented the steady flow of young people leaving the church in North America at an alarming rate. Yet, while a growing number of young adults are leaving the church, there are other trends as well. Some younger Christians are choosing to remain in the fold of Christianity, but that doesn't mean they are content with the existing expressions of evangelical faith. Many young believers from different backgrounds and traditions are staying in the church while embracing a liturgical expression of the faith. And while it is most noticeable among young adults, this trend is true of people of various ages and backgrounds as well. Believers who are seeking to recover ancient practices of the Christian faith. This growing phenomenon has found expression at universities, colleges, and seminary campuses. I've spent several years speaking to many of these individuals, interviewing them and asking them why they are turning to the past and how they are integrating it into their own faith. I've come to realize it is just the latest expression of a continual trend in every generation as believers seek to recover the historic roots of the church. Commenting on the movement we see today, author and Anglican Bishop Todd Hunter proclaims, "There is something in the air today, something in the spirit of our age, something in the spirit that is leading thousands, maybe millions, of people to reconsider liturgical forms of worship." Perhaps the most notable scholar to recognize this growing trend among Christians was the late theologian Robert Webber. During his lifetime, Webber wrote more than 40 books, including the fascinating story of his own journey, Evangelicals on the Canterbury Trail, first published in 1985. In this book, Webber expounds upon his own personal progression from being a member of a fundamentalist Baptist church to becoming a professor at Wheaton College and eventually joining the Episcopal Church. After experiencing this shift in his own life, Webber realized that many younger Christians during his own lifetime had embarked on similar journeys toward recovering the Church's ancient rhythms of liturgy. As an attempt at explaining this shift, Webber analyzed the movement and found that the primary source for younger evangelical spirituality, other than the Bible, is the past. Driven by a deeply felt need for belonging, these individuals were denying modernity's valuation of newness and reaching toward a tradition that runs much deeper than their own lifetime. Today, almost 40 years since Webber published his story, we see this trend growing with a new generation of young believers. While Webber's research and writing favored evangelically friendly liturgical streams, the movement is not confined to evangelicals alone. Webber's voice was joined by author Phyllis Tickle, who believed that the trend of reaching back to the past is taking place among the next generation. Tickle believed that it is not evangelicals who are on the Canterbury Trail. Rather, it is a much larger company who, in large part, are either on the Canterbury Trail or are absorbing and reemploying the characteristics, spirituality, and practices of pilgrims. Many of these pilgrims, she describes, are young adults. After encountering such power in traditional practices and liturgy, they have begun to seek places that effectively incorporate ancient practices into modern contexts. Throughout this book, I want to share how my own encounters have led me to explore the allure of liturgy for those in a new generation. For the past 2 years, I have traveled across the United States, Canada, and England visiting churches, cathedrals, universities, and seminaries. I have listened to dozens of young adults share how they have embraced Christian liturgy. I have heard stories about how liturgy is impacting many lives, and I have interviewed hundreds of young adults and leaders to hear their stories about how liturgy has impacted their faith. They are hipsters, authors, teachers, students, pastors, musicians, and people from all walks of faith, but they have one thing in common. They have found a home in the liturgical practice of the historic church. You may notice that I often use the term young adults. I'm intentionally using this phrase because the trends I've observed aren't limited to a single generation. By young adults, I'm roughly speaking of those born from the early 1970s through the mid 1990s, a span that includes millennials and the younger members of Generation X, or Gen X for short. I live with one foot on each side of this new generation I speak about, as a Gen Xer married to a millennial. In addition, I live, work, and teach in college and seminary communities. So much of my life involves interacting with the young adults of today. I've divided Ever Ancient, Ever New into three parts to help you better navigate the contents: foundations, journeys, and practices. Part 1 lays the foundations of why young adults are drawn to liturgy. Part 2 examines various paths that are leading them into embracing liturgy. And Part 3 looks at how liturgy offers practices that can be lived out in our daily lives, and how those practices prepare us to live out our faith in the world. In the following pages, we will explore how a generation is finding new depths to their faith as they rediscover liturgy. We will see how and why liturgy has beckoned them deeper, what types of churches and communities foster this convergence of old and new, and much more. My hope is that in reading this book and the stories in it, you'll be better able to recognize and appreciate how ancient practices and principles can help you grow in Christ with a holistic and embodied faith. As we walk alongside several young people who are traveling this journey, we'll see firsthand how traditional liturgical and ancient practices are providing fresh expressions of a timeless faith in the ever-changing context of postmodernity. We won't find the answers to our current church crisis by inventing new, innovative ideas, nor will an awareness of the past magically fix the problems of the present. Instead, we'll find signposts pointing toward the future as we explore the intersection where the past and the present meet. The young adults in this book embody this place of convergence, and together we could very well be on the verge of a new wave of God's grace as we discover the great foundations of faith and look toward the future. Finally, I don't think the recovery of liturgy is merely a trend among young people. It is something much bigger than I first realized. What I've come to recognize is that there appears to be something significant undergirding the recovery of liturgy. Perhaps you've asked the question, what about liturgy is attracting young people, and why does it matter for today? I have come to the conclusion that liturgy, when rightly appropriated, is one of the best ways for us to make disciples in a postmodern context. It is this emphasis, the appropriation of ancient practices for disciple formation today, that is the unifying theme of this book. My hope in exploring the profound vitality of the ancient practices these young adults have discovered is that regardless of your age or background, your faith will be renewed as you hear their stories and encounter the power of liturgical practices for yourself. I hope that through this book you will find fresh ways of exploring and engaging with these historic practices in meaningful ways. To help you do this, I have added reflection questions and practices at the end of each chapter. Let's get started.